My mother-in-law secretly recorded every fight my husband and I had for 3 years. Then she walked into a courtroom and used every single one. There is a specific kind of violation that doesn't have a clean name. It's not theft, exactly. It's not assault. It's the feeling of discovering that someone you allowed inside your home, inside your marriage, inside the private walls of your daily life, was listening the entire time. Recording, cataloging, waiting. That is what happened to me. And by the time I found out, it was almost too late. My name is Simone. I am 36 years old, and I was married for 8 years to a man named Daniel, and for most of those 8 years his mother, Carol, was a constant presence in our lives in the way that certain mothers-in-law become. Not through cruelty, not at first, but through sheer relentless proximity. She lived 12 minutes from our house. She had a key. She came over without calling, stayed longer than planned, and inserted herself into the texture of our marriage so gradually and so completely that by the time I understood how deep she was in, removing her felt like trying to remove a root system from under a house. Daniel was her only child. His father had left when Daniel was 3 years old and had not, as far as I ever understood, been a meaningful presence since. Carol had raised Daniel alone, working 2 jobs, and she had done it with a ferocity and a dedication that was genuinely admirable, and that had also produced, in Daniel, a man who was psychologically incapable of disappointing his mother. Not unwilling. Incapable. The distinction matters. He did not choose her over me in moments of conflict. He simply ceased to function as an independent adult whenever her preferences were in play. It was like watching a circuit breaker trip. I had understood this about him before we married. I had told myself it was something we would work through together. I had been wrong about that, and I had spent several years being wrong about it in the privacy of our own home, in arguments that cycled through the same territory without resolution, in the particular exhaustion of fighting about the same things so many times that the fighting itself starts to feel like the relationship. What I did not know, what I could not have imagined, was that those arguments were being recorded. It started, as I would later reconstruct it, about a year into our marriage. Carol had given us a gift, a smart home device, one of those speaker systems that sits on the counter and plays music and answers questions and does all the small convenient things those devices do. I had thought nothing of it. We had thanked her. We had put it in the kitchen, where it lived on the counter by the coffee maker for the next 3 years, playing music on Sunday mornings and setting timers when my hands were full of something and being, as far as I was concerned, a completely neutral piece of technology. It was not neutral. The device was connected to Carol's account. Not ours, hers. I do not know if she had done this deliberately from the beginning, or if it had happened through some technical process she had later realized she could exploit. What I know is that for 3 years, that device had a microphone and Carol had access to the recordings it generated, and the device sat in our kitchen where Daniel and I had nearly every significant conversation of our marriage. I found out the way you find out things you were never supposed to know. By accident, through a door someone left open that they meant to keep closed. Daniel and I had been in a rough stretch, not dramatically worse than previous rough stretches, but longer, more wearing, with less recovery time between conflicts. He had started spending more time at his mother's house, which I had expressed frustration about, which had produced more conflict, which had sent him back to his mother's house. We had been in couples therapy for 4 months with a therapist named Dr. Wren who was patient and skilled, and who was, I realize now, working with a dataset that was deliberately incomplete. One evening Daniel came home from Carol's in a strange mood. Not his usual post-Carol visit smoothness, but something more unsettled. He was quiet through dinner. After Lily went to bed, we have a daughter. She was 5 at the time. He sat down at the kitchen table and said he needed to tell me something. He said his mother had recordings. I did not immediately understand what that meant. I asked him to explain. He explained it haltingly, in the way of someone relaying information they wish they did not have to relay, and as he talked the shape of it assembled itself in my mind with a horrible, progressive clarity. The device on the counter. Carol's account. 3 years. He had found out himself only recently, he said. She had played him a recording during one of his visits. She had done it to show him something, to make a point about our marriage, and he had listened to it, and then he had come home, and he was telling me now. I looked at the device on the counter by the coffee maker. I had a very specific thought, which was, How many times did I stand in this kitchen and say things I believed were private? How many arguments? How many moments of raw frustration? How many times did I say something in the heat of conflict that I would have phrased differently with more time, with more sleep, with more composure? How many of those moments were sitting on a server somewhere, extracted from context, stripped of the repair that came after, preserved as evidence for a case I didn't know was being built? I asked Daniel what she intended to do with them. He didn't answer right away. And the pause before he answered told me more than the answer itself. Carol had been speaking with a family attorney. She had been expressing concerns, documented, recorded, evidence concerns, about the environment in which her grandchild was being raised. She believed, based on the arguments she had cataloged over 3 years, that I was emotionally unstable, volatile, and potentially harmful. She was considering, Daniel told me quietly, whether to bring these concerns to the attention of relevant parties if our marriage continued to deteriorate. Relevant parties. The phrasing of someone who has been talking to lawyers. I sat across from my husband, and I thought about every argument we had ever had in that kitchen. Every moment of anger, of frustration, of the kind of ugly imprecision that comes out when you are exhausted and hurt and fighting with someone you love about the same thing for the 40th time. None of those moments, taken alone, represented who I was. All of them, strung together without context, without repair, without the mornings after where we sat together quietly and found our way back. All of them, assembled by someone who had been curating them for years with a specific purpose, could be made to look like something they were not. That night, I called my sister. That night, I also called an attorney, a woman named Patricia, who a colleague had mentioned in passing, the kind of mention you store without expecting to use. I left a message. She called back at 7 the next morning, and I told her everything, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "The recordings are one issue. The device is another. And the intent behind both of them is a third. I'd like to see you this week." Patricia was, in a word, formidable. She was the kind of attorney who made you feel, immediately upon meeting her, that you were now on the correct side of whatever was about to happen. She laid out the situation in clear terms. The legality of the recordings was, she said, complicated. It depended on state law, on the specific setup of the device, on whether Daniel had effectively consented on behalf of both of us by using the device knowingly. This was not going to be a simple suppression argument. What was more immediately actionable, she said, was the intent. A third party who had systematically collected private information about a marriage with the express purpose of using it in legal proceedings against one of the parties was not operating in good faith, and there were legal and procedural ways to address that. She also said something that I have thought about many times since. The most important thing right now is not what she has. It's what you do next. What I did next was make an appointment with a digital forensics specialist, a quiet man named Arthur, who Patricia had worked with before and who, within a week, had fully analyzed the device and confirmed what Daniel had told me. The device had been registered to Carol's account from its initial setup. It had been configured, through settings that were not default, to retain audio recordings beyond the standard brief window most of these devices use. The recordings went back, as far as Arthur could determine, almost 3 full years. Arthur also found something else, which was that the device had been accessed remotely on dozens of occasions, Carol logging in to the associated app from her phone to review recordings. He had timestamps. He had a log of every access. He had, in the careful language of someone who has done this many times, a complete picture of what had been happening in our kitchen. Patricia filed a motion I will not try to explain in technical terms except to say that it put Carol's access to those recordings and her intentions regarding them directly in front of a judge before she had the chance to deploy them the way she had planned. The motion also introduced Arthur's forensic report. The judge's response to that report was, according to Patricia, not warm. Daniel, through all of this, was fragmenting in the way he always fragmented when his mother and his marriage pulled in opposite directions, except that this time the stakes were higher than any previous version of that conflict. He came to me twice in that period and said he had known, that he hadn't been part of it, that he was horrified. I believed him that he hadn't planned it. I was less certain about how horrified he truly was, because horror and inaction can coexist in people who are deeply conditioned to protect their parents at all costs. He did not confront his mother in any meaningful way. He expressed distress. He came home and expressed that distress to me. He did not, as far as I could determine, actually stop it from moving forward, which told me something about the difference between being sorry and being willing to bear any cost to make something right. Carol, for her part, denied, initially, that she had any recordings at all. When Arthur's forensic report made this position untenable, her attorney shifted to arguing that the recordings were legal, that the device had been a gift that the couple had chosen to use knowingly, and that the content of the recordings was merely documentation of a genuinely troubled domestic environment. Her attorney made this argument with what I imagine was a straight face. Patricia made a different argument. Patricia made the argument that a grandmother who had covertly harvested 3 years of private marital audio, stored it against the advice of any reasonable ethical standard, reviewed it remotely on dozens of occasions, and brought it to a family attorney with the stated intention of using it to influence custody proceedings was not a person operating from a place of good faith concern for a grandchild. She was a person operating from a place of control, possessiveness, and the specific kind of love that expresses itself through the elimination of perceived threats. The judge agreed with Patricia's framing more than Carol's. The recordings were not admitted. The attempted use of them was noted as a significant factor in the court's subsequent assessment of Carol's judgment and her appropriate role in custody and family proceedings going forward. She had built, carefully and over years, what she believed was an arsenal. The court looked at that arsenal and saw instead a portrait of someone who should be taken seriously as a risk, not to me, but to the integrity of the family proceedings themselves. The marriage did not survive this. I want to be honest about that without making it sound simple, because it wasn't. Daniel and I had real problems that existed independently of his mother, and those problems had produced the arguments that Carol had collected, and the fact that she had weaponized those arguments did not mean the arguments themselves were without substance. We tried, for several months after the recordings came to light, to rebuild something. Dr. Wren continued to see us. We added another therapist, individually, for each of us. But there is something that happens to a marriage when you discover that its most private moments were surveilled by a third party who is actively working against one of you. It is not something that therapy fully repairs, at least not in a timeline that the two people involved can sustain together. The trust that was broken was not only between Daniel and me, it was between me and the physical space of our shared life. I could not stand in our kitchen and not think about the device that had sat there. I could not have a difficult conversation without a ghost of awareness that privacy is not guaranteed by walls. We separated 14 months after Daniel came home from his mother's house with the news. The divorce was, compared to what had preceded it, relatively civil. Patricia handled it. We shared custody of our daughter in an arrangement that is imperfect in the way all arrangements dividing a child between two houses are imperfect, but that is functional and consistent, and that prioritizes her in the ways that matter most. Carol's role in her granddaughter's life is now supervised and structured in ways it was not before. This was not something I pushed for out of vindictiveness. I want to be clear about that. I pushed for it because a woman who recorded 3 years of my private life and brought those recordings to an attorney to use against me in custody proceedings is a woman who has demonstrated, clearly and documentedly, that she is willing to harm people she ostensibly loves in order to maintain control over situations that frighten her. I did not want my daughter to grow up inside that dynamic without guardrails. The device is gone, obviously. I stood in my kitchen on the day I made the decision to file for divorce, and I picked it up and I walked outside, and I put it in the recycling bin, and I stood there for a moment in the cold and breathed. What I want anyone listening to take from this story is something that took me a long time to understand, which is that the people who surveil us rarely do it from a place of pure malice. Carol loved Daniel. In her way, she probably loved our daughter. What she could not tolerate was the idea that there were parts of Daniel's life she did not have access to, parts of his world that were closed to her, a marriage that sometimes competed with her for his loyalty and sometimes won. The recordings were not an act of hatred. They were an act of desperate, consuming need for control dressed up as protection. That doesn't make them acceptable. It doesn't make the violation smaller. But understanding the root of something is different from excusing it, and I have found in the time since that understanding it has made me less consumed by it. Carol is a person who is so afraid of losing her son that she burned down the village to keep him close, and what she produced instead was distance and documented evidence of her own judgment and a court order governing her access to her grandchild. You cannot control people into staying. You can only control them into leaving more carefully. My daughter asked me recently, with the directness of a 6-year-old who has not yet learned that some questions are meant to be asked only inside your own head, why Grandma Carol doesn't come over anymore the same way she used to. I told her that Grandma Carol and I had some disagreements and that we were figuring out the best way for everyone to spend time together. She thought about this with great seriousness and then said, "Did she do something mean?"
Kids know.
They always know. They don't have the language for it yet, but they feel the shape of things long before adults admit them. "She made some choices that weren't kind," I said. "But she loves you." My daughter considered this. "Both things can be true," she said, which is something she had heard Dr. Wren say in a family session 6 months earlier and had apparently filed away for future deployment. "Yes," I said. "Both things can be true." My kitchen is quiet now in the mornings. I bought a new coffee maker. A different one, nothing attached to any account that isn't mine, nothing that listens beyond the moment of a command. The light comes through the window and the room is warm and there is no device on the counter cataloging anything. I make coffee and I drink it and the silence is mine. That is not a small thing. After everything, the recordings, the attorney, the courtroom, the end of a marriage, the rebuilding, what I find myself most grateful for is the silence. The unrecorded, unwatched, unweaponized ordinary silence of a morning that belongs only to me. Nobody is listening. For the first time in years, nobody is listening. And I can breathe.